press calls him the Hillside Strangler, but he may be part of a deadly duo. With little to go on, investigators face an uphill struggle as women continue to die. California's state parks contain hundreds of trails, but only one trailside killer. When the crime scene is as big as all outdoors, how can detectives hope to find him? A Midwestern highway is littered with the bodies of young men. Authorities know the identity of the interstate killer, but can they prove it before he kills again? Spurred on by the thrill of the kill, a serial murderer can't stop on his own. The longer it takes to catch him, the bigger the body count. They started on Halloween 1977. In the foothills just north of Los Angeles, the morning light brought a resident of a quiet suburban neighborhood a glimpse of horror. Sprawled in his front yard was a naked woman. She was dead. Not wanting his children to see the body, he covered her with a tarp. Detective Frank Salerno was one of the first inspectors to arrive.
When I initially got the call, I was told that it may be an overdose. It was as soon as I saw the body, it appeared to me without a doubt that it was a murder, not a drug overdose of any type.
There were ligature marks around her neck, wrists, and ankles, indicating that the woman had been tied up and strangled to death. She had also been raped. Police had no idea who she was or where she had come from. The only possible clue found at the scene was a small piece of white fiber on the victim's eyelid. It wasn't much, but it was all authorities had to work with. But Detective Salerno noticed one more thing that would be crucial to their search. It was the way the body lay.
She looked like she'd been placed at the location. She didn't look like she had been tossed. It actually looked like maybe two people had carried her, maybe lifted her out of a trunk, lifted her from the bed of a pickup truck or something, and one had carried her from underneath her armpits and one had carried her from underneath her legs and placed her there. So it was just an overall impression that we may be dealing with two people.
Investigators assumed this brutal strangling and the killer's careless disposal of the body was an isolated incident, just another unfortunate murder in Los Angeles. But the Halloween murder was only the beginning. Less than a week later, a jogger happened upon the nude body of a woman lying in plain sight beside the jogging path. With the second body, a deadly pattern began to emerge. Both victims had been raped, strangled, and dumped out in the open for anyone to find. Both bodies were practically on display, disposed of on slight inclines or hills.
The only difference was that you had different bodies, but you had the same marks on the wrist in the same locations. You had the same marks on the ankles, almost to the inch of where they were on each body. You had the same mark on the throat, the same ligature mark. So at that point we knew that we had a single killer or killers that were at least responsible for two murders.
But the murders didn't stop there. The press, unaware that authorities were searching for two suspects, dubbed the killer the Hillside Strangler. On November 20th, a 9-year-old boy was playing near his house when he spied what he thought were two mannequins. Upon closer inspection, he realized they were not. Dolores Cepeda and Sonia Johnson had been missing for over a week before their bodies were found. They weren't even 15 years old. The crime fit the Strangler's pattern to a T, except in this instance, there was a witness. A boy had seen the girls on the day of their disappearance. Once they got off the bus, he noticed they stopped to talk to someone in a car. He didn't see the stranger's face, but remembered the car was a large sedan. The girls' principal also gave police some useful information. She knew the girls personally and insisted that with the ever-present scare of the hillside strangler, the girls would probably not have gone anywhere with a stranger, unless that stranger was masquerading as a policeman. Tension in the city and within the police force became palpable, and officers stepped up their efforts to find the killers, whoever they might be.
We were spending 7 days a week, 12, 15 hours a day working. That didn't slow down ever.
Police had only hunches and few clues about the hillside strangler. They weren't sure if they were looking for one man or two, or whether the killer was truly an officer or just posing. Only one thing was certain. With each passing night, more women would die. November 28th. The killers did not take Thanksgiving off. When Lauren Wagner's parents realized she hadn't come in from the night before, they panicked. Even more disturbing was the fact that her car was parked out front. Whatever happened to Lauren took place after she got home. Officers canvassed the neighborhood looking for any lead that might point them to a suspect.
Have you heard seen anything suspicious in the area?
One neighbor recalled seeing Lauren pull up around 9 p.m., followed by another car. Two men jumped out and started arguing with her. The witness told investigators they didn't look like police. Even so, Lauren got into the car with them and drove off. Her body was found the next day. In addition to the strangler's telltale markings, some small fibers were found on Wagner's body. They didn't match the fiber found on the first victim. After 9 brutal murders, it was only the second time any evidence was collected from a victim. Police continued to scour the streets, but with nothing more than a vague description of the suspect's car, there was not much to go on, and absolutely no way to match the fibers with the killer. The witness's report did, however, confirm the police's theory of 2 killers, and authorities now believe the men were merely posing as police. Six weeks later, the body of an 18-year-old prostitute turned up. This time, the killers were toying with police, like a cat with a mouse. They dumped the body on a hillside with City Hall as a backdrop.
But it just seemed like they were trying to give us a message that they were still operating. They were operating with impunity. They could do whatever they wanted when they wanted.
Police searched the apartment the prostitute had gone to that night and found fingerprints that they thought might belong to the killer, but they didn't come up with any matches in their databases. Then, as suddenly as the murders began, they stopped. With such little evidence to go on, there was not much detectives could do but sit and wait. After 4 months of terror in Los Angeles, an eerie calm fell over the city. The killers were still out there, but no one knew when or where the hillside stranglers would strike next.
We don't have quotas. You can write as many as you want.
In Bellingham, Washington, January 1979, a man reported that his girlfriend and her roommate were missing. He told police they were supposed to be house-sitting for an acquaintance who worked as a security guard.
We all know him pretty well. That's all I've got. Do you guys have enough?
Investigators went to the women's apartment. From the moment he arrived, Bellingham Police Chief Terry Mangan knew that Diane Wilder and Karen Mandick were in danger.
And it was evident as soon as we got there that something was terribly wrong, in the sense that they had left Diane Wilder's car there with some groceries in it, some of which needed to be refrigerated. The cat had not been fed or let out, and the lights were on.
In a situation like this, it's difficult to discern what might be a clue. Police collected what they could, including a business card for a security guard named Kenneth Bianchi, and a message in Diane Wilder's handwriting that said he'd called. Bianchi seemed like an obvious suspect,
Hi, I'm Detective
but when
Henderson.
police interviewed him, he denied knowing the women
Investigating
or of any
homicide that
house-sitting
occurred
arrangement.
last night.
He told them that he was at a law enforcement class that night, training to become a member of the sheriff's reserves.
Scott, X30, you copy?
Hours later, police received the call they were dreading. A car had been discovered near a deserted construction site. Inside were two bodies, Diane Wilder and Karen Mandick. They had been strangled. Detectives determined that the murders most likely took place somewhere else, and whoever had left the bodies there had taken careful measures to clean up after himself. Authorities had trouble lifting fingerprints off the car. It had been wiped clean.
Diane Wilder and Karen Mandick, both of them Western Washington students.
Bellingham police criminalist
were
Bob
seen,
Knudsen processed the scene.
Leaving Fred Meyer's at about 7 o'clock. This was, in our opinion, definitely not a first-time killer. This is somebody who had been there before.
But no matter how expert a killer is, chances are he'll leave a trace of himself behind. A single hair that did not belong to either of the women gave detectives some hope of linking the crime to a suspect. On one of the women's shoes and clothes were fuzzy gold fibers, most likely from a carpet. Locating the source might lead investigators to the murder site. Though finding a gold carpet would be no problem, the chances of finding the right one were slim. Detectives checked on an address found in the glove box. As the examination continued, authorities found something else. Stuck to the underside of the car were sprigs of fresh heather. Police brought the car to the lab to study the underside more closely. They found several fresh scrapes on the gas tank. Investigators speculated that when the killer threw the bodies into the car, the weight forced the back of the vehicle down onto a rock or something similar. The killer may have scraped the gas tank as he pulled away. A rock, a sprig of heather, and some gold carpet fibers. The perfect ingredients for a mystery. But how
I
to
have some
solve it?
update on the missing girls, the co-ed case. Control. We'll get the volunteers out
The
there
address
to
in the
work with
glove
them.
box
We're gonna
led
have
to
a
an
very,
empty,
very
locked
large
house with
case.
gold carpeting.
We're gonna try and
To obtain a key, police
I
contacted
think
the
what we'll
security
do is
company
we
that
can,
monitored it.
Jack
It was the
Hansen
same security company that Kenneth Bianchi worked for.
have the best plan, and we'll just assign some extra.
They told police that the key was missing from their file.
Yeah, we're going to,
While the paperwork allowing them to enter the house was being processed, investigators examined the grounds.
But there was some heather and bushes and things there, and Bob Knudsen pushed, as I recall, pushed the heather aside, he and Terry White, and there were scrapes, fresh scrapes on the rock under the heather, which subsequently matched the scrapes in the gas tank in the bottom of the car.
Yep.
Yeah, it's a good match.
Yeah, All we got to do now is finish photoing the rock, get it ready for court.
Inside the house, investigators found hair from 3 persons. 2 matched the victims. The 3rd matched the unknown hair also found in the automobile. The car, the 2 women, and a 3rd person had been at the house. And the only people who had access to the house while the owners were away were the employees of the security company. Once again, police turned to Kenneth Bianchi. Authorities obtained a warrant to search Bianchi's house for clues to the murder. What they found instead was a basement full of stolen goods. The stolen property was enough grounds to arrest Bianchi and hold him until police could gather evidence to link him to the murders. Investigators later learned that he never showed up at his law enforcement class on the night Wilder and Mandic disappeared. Police had no trouble finding him on patrol at his security job. Forensic specialists matched the foreign hairs found in the car and the house in Washington to Bianchi. Undoubtedly, he had been at these locations. Though confident that Bianchi would prove to be their man, investigators had no idea who they actually had on their hands.
Frank
A
Salerno?
California driver's license found in his possession prompted a call to the Los Angeles authorities to check on prior offenses. The detective that took the call was part of the Hillside Strangler task force and recognized the similarities.
Yeah, I'm sitting down.
It was the call Detective Frank Salerno had been waiting 2 long years to receive.
You're kidding me. Not only did he live next door and across street from 2 of our victims, but he had lived on Tamarind, which was the Kimberly Martin case. So right away, we've got a guy that's connected by location to 3 of the victims, and we never had that before.
Hair found in his car in Washington State matched 2 of the Hillside victims in Los Angeles.
Yes.
Bianchi's fingerprints also linked him to the murder of the prostitute. Faced with undeniable evidence, Bianchi confessed to the Hillside stranglings and named his cousin, Angelo Bono, as his accomplice.
Well, we took all the evidence, which amounted to 1 tuft of fiber and 1 clump of fiber, and we served a search warrant on Angelo Bono's house and his trim shop.
A search of Bono's car upholstery shop brought an exact match of the white fibers found on 2 of the Hillside victims.
When I pick her up, you get in.
The cousins explained how they found their targets, cruising the streets of Hollywood posing as undercover cops. Some of the victims were prostitutes who were easy to lure into the car. Others were simply stopped and arrested on bogus charges. Once a woman was in the car, she was handcuffed and taken to Bono's shop, where she'd be tied up, raped, and strangled to death. Then, it was just a matter of disposing of the body under cover of darkness.
Just stand here.
On the corner by yourself,
On the
just
corner,
like that.
yeah.
California instead of Washington are giving up the death penalty.
How does a defendant plead to count 1 of the information?
Guilty, Your Honor.
How does the defendant plead to count 2 of the information?
Guilty.
Bianchi pled guilty to 2 first-degree murders in Washington and confessed to 10 murders in California. He and Angelo Bono are currently serving multiple life terms without parole. Many consider big cities to be havens for violence and murder. But the truth is, there's no law that keeps serial killers within city limits. In October 1980, some hikers were enjoying the serene beauty of Mount Tamalpais State Park in Northern California when they made a gruesome discovery. The body of a young woman lay flat on the ground. She had been shot in the head and raped. Police arrived to process the scene. The victim was 26-year-old Ann Alderson. She'd gone to the park to meditate the day before and had not returned. Detective Rich Keaton of the Marin County Sheriff's Department led the investigation.
The park is almost like a sanctuary, and it has kind of a reverence in it, and overlooking San Francisco Bay. And to have such a violent crime occur in a pristine area was just out of the ordinary.
There was not much evidence at the scene. Traces of biological material found around the body and the bullets removed from the victim were sent to the crime lab in Santa Rosa with the hopes that they might point to a suspect. Forensic specialist Mike Waller set out to determine what type of weapon was used in the murder.
By evaluating the bullet under a stereo microscope such as what I have here, and by looking at the class characteristics and measuring them, we can get an idea of a potential model or make in some cases. And one weapon that was a possibility in this case turned out to be what is known as a Rossi .38 special revolver.
We've done the aerial photos.
Without a suspect or weapon, the identification provided no help. Investigators had no choice but to shelve the case until more information turned up. They didn't have long to wait. A month after the murder, detectives were searching for two missing women on the trails at Point Reyes National Seashore in Marin County. But they didn't find what they were looking for. Two bodies, a man and a woman, lay face down in the woods. They had been shot to death. Police surveyed the scene but were disappointed with their findings. They uncovered no footprints. There were no hairs or fibers, only the bullets. While officers finished processing the scene, police found the women they had been looking for. They too were dead. Both women were naked. They had been shot and raped. No fingerprints or other telltale clues were found.
My first impressions were that this was almost a shock that this wasn't really happening. We couldn't have 4 more bodies found in a park of young women and one young man who were simply executed for what appeared to be no other reason than sexual violation.
Investigators now had 5 murders and still only a handful of bullets as clues. By examining the barrel marks left on the bullets, Mike Waller confirmed authorities' worst fears. All the bullets recovered from the various scenes had been fired from the same gun. Now there was no question about it. A serial killer was stalking victims in the state parks. But detectives were no closer to finding who he was. Papers called the murderer the Trailside Killer. Detectives knew that a true serial killer wouldn't stop until he was caught, and catching him wouldn't be easy. The killer was cunning, the murders well planned. Police hoped that someone may have spied the killer before he made his kills. A task force collected accounts from people who had seen a strange man on the hiking trails earlier in the day. They put together a composite sketch from their descriptions. Investigators also assembled a profile of their suspect based on case histories of similar murderers. He would be a white male, 20 to 25, who was tall and thin, with black hair. He would be good-looking and charming, an outgoing guy with a winning personality. Once the sketch was approved by the task force, Flyers were distributed throughout the county to alert the public. Warnings were posted at the state parks, and agents hiked the trails undercover. The FBI was brought in to assist with the investigation. Police were busy hatching an elaborate plan to stop the killer. They called it Code 555. The idea was to immediately shut down all roads leading out of the county the second the next attack was reported. It wouldn't prevent another murder, but it was the only way authorities could see to apprehend a suspect. And something had to be done. The community was frightened to death. The hiking trails became vacant. People quit coming to the parks. The suspect's face was posted everywhere in an effort to warn the people of Marin County. But police were ready. Code 555 could be deployed in a moment's notice. Next time the trailside killer struck, there would be no escape.
Bodies were found on the left-hand side of the mountain.
Like in some fairy tale, in the beautiful mountains of Northern California, there dwelled a monster. Though 4 months had passed without incident, investigators knew the trailside killer wasn't finished. In March of 1981, visitors to Henry Cowell State Park were taking a break at the observation deck when they heard screams. Help! A terrified young man was limping up the trail toward them, yelling hysterically. He had been hiking with his girlfriend when a stranger approached and shot them both. His girlfriend was dead, and the killer was still loose in the park. The police arrived in minutes, but the murderer had slipped away undetected. Stephen Hartle was rushed to the hospital. Marin County Police had been ready for the trailside killer, prepared to shut down all exits from the county. It would have worked, except that this latest attack occurred outside their jurisdiction in Santa Cruz County. The trailside killer was on the move.
He took great delight in watching what the police agencies were trying to do, and that he was staying always one step ahead of us, one step ahead of apprehension, and was probably taking great glee into the fact that he was not being identified, not being discovered. And I'm sure that he was reading every news article that came out.
Santa Cruz police found some footprints at the scene and took plaster casts for future comparison. Those and the bullets were almost all the evidence authorities had. But there was one thing the killer didn't count on. Stephen Hartle had survived the shooting. He was an eyewitness. But when police showed him the sketch of the trailside killer, something was horribly wrong. Hartle didn't recognize him. In fact, he was certain his shooter was another man. Authorities now faced the shocking possibility that Hartle and his girlfriend were victims of a copycat. The man Hartle described looked nothing like the killer in Marin County. He was large with broad shoulders. He wore glasses, a mustache, and had thinning hair. And most unlike the trailside killer, this man was 20 or 25 years older. Detectives swiftly distributed the second sketch around the area and redoubled their efforts to catch not one, but two killers.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.
Then, a call came in to Detective Keaton that set the record straight. The lab had compared the bullets from the Santa Cruz attack to the ones in Marin County. They were a perfect match. The bullets had been fired from the same gun. There was no younger man. The first suspect composite had been a terrible, time-consuming mistake. Authorities had been looking for the wrong man. They quickly dispensed with the first sketch and concentrated on the eyewitness account.
So instead of it being a young white male in his early to mid-20s, we were looking at a male who was actually about 50 years of age.
Hey, hon.
While the hunt continued, people went about their daily lives. Heather Skaggs needed a car. She'd shopped around for a few months with her boyfriend, but had no luck.
It's David Carpenter.
She decided to check out a car that one of her co-workers had found for sale.
Yeah, I've got a number in my purse, because I do need to get going down here.
Before she went off, she jotted her co-worker's phone number. His name was David Carpenter.
Yeah, but listen, I'll just talk to
Heather
you
was
later.
running a little late and had to rush if she was going to meet Carpenter on time. They said their goodbyes, and then Heather left for the last time. In the morning, when she hadn't come home, her boyfriend turned to David Carpenter for answers.
Okay.
Carpenter hadn't seen Heather or heard from her at all that day. Concerned, her boyfriend went to the police. When police questioned Carpenter, he told them the same story. But his resemblance to the sketch of the trailside killer was difficult to overlook. For 2 weeks, they kept him under surveillance. When a background check revealed that he'd previously been convicted for rape and assault, investigators brought him in. Although the murder weapon was nowhere to be found, investigators retrieved a single .38 caliber bullet from his car. It was rushed to the lab for analysis. Heather Skaggs' body was found a few days later.
They can't see through the glass. Okay.
Stephen Hartle had recovered fully from the attack and was brought in to look at a lineup. He had no trouble picking out the man who had shot him and killed his girlfriend. There was no doubt in his mind that David Carpenter was that man.
Good afternoon.
At long last, authorities believed they had captured the trailside killer. Finally, the parks were safe. The senseless murders would stop. But to make the case, officers still needed to find the murder weapon. Then, police received word from a man in prison who had known Carpenter. He had information to share in exchange for a lighter sentence. He told police that if they searched a certain vacant lot in San Francisco, they'd find Carpenter's gun buried under some rubble. The weapon was sent back to Mike Waller at the lab for final testing and identification.
We got knives, we got guns.
By test firing the gun himself, Waller had bullets to compare with those collected from the murder sites.
Fire in the hole!
When the two were put together, they matched perfectly. Without question, both bullets were fired from the same gun. Police had in their possession the weapon that had killed 7 people. In addition to the ballistics evidence, blood and saliva samples taken from Carpenter matched the biological evidence taken at the first crime scene. And Carpenter had recently purchased a pair of shoes with treads that were consistent with the casts taken from the trails. David Carpenter had little trouble finding and capturing his victims. From a mountain vantage point, he could oversee the trails and make out lone hikers. Knowing exactly where they were headed, he could easily ambush his prey. In execution style, Carpenter shot his victims in the back of the head. David Carpenter was convicted of a total of 7 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of rape. He was given 2 death sentences. Carpenter specifically targeted women for his sexual gratification. Male victims were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Though most serial killers are men, they don't always prey on the opposite sex. In the spring of 1983, a young man was discovered dead in a field off Interstate 294 in Lake County, Illinois, just outside Chicago. He had been bound, tortured, undressed, and stabbed multiple times. It appeared to be an isolated incident. But within a few weeks, another body turned up just off the interstate, less than a mile from the first, and in eerily similar condition. In both cases, detectives could find little at the crime scenes to lead them to the killer. 4 months later, a third victim, Ralph Calise, was found murdered in the same manner along the same stretch of highway where the first two victims were found. The press gave the murderer a name, the Interstate Killer. It was at the Calise site that authorities gathered what they hoped would be their first fruitful clues. Most important were footprints and tire tracks. Although not necessarily connected to the murder, it was the first time any type of prints had been recovered. Investigators made plaster casts in case a suspect emerged. Detective Dan Collin knew it would only be a matter of time before he killed again.
When we had the third victim in August, which was Ralph Calise, then we knew we had obviously an individual working the north side of Chicago. If you're still alive over there.
Aware that serial killers often move around to avoid capture, Collin notified neighboring jurisdictions. When Lake County Police described their victims, authorities in Indiana recognized the pattern all too well. They had been investigating 9 of their own unsolved murders that fit the killer's profile. All the victims had been stabbed in similar fashion and abandoned near highways. The manhunt took on new urgency now that police knew the killer had crisscrossed state lines to murder 12 men.
It's actually right off the map.
In their pursuit of the interstate killer, Indiana and Illinois law enforcement pooled their resources. Acting on a tip, Indianapolis police had singled out one suspect, a man named Larry Eiler, who had been arrested for a similar crime and acquitted. Even as Indiana's #1 suspect, there was no hard evidence against him. Authorities couldn't make a move until he moved first. But when and if he did, they were ready for him. Illinois police had the plaster casts of the footprints and tires taken from their last crime scene. If Indiana authorities could find a way to compare the prints with Eiler's, they were welcome to them. In less than a month, they'd have their chance. On September 30th, 1983, an Indiana state trooper stopped to question 2 men in a truck parked on the side of a road near Interstate 65. The driver explained that they had just stopped for a bathroom break, but the patrolman ran a routine check anyway. He called in the driver's name. It was Larry Eiler.
So what happened was when the state trooper ran his name, one of the dispatchers recognized the name, and from there contacted a detective sergeant with the Indiana State Police, who then said arrest Larry and bring him into custody and bring him to a little station for questioning.
Among the things found in Eiler's truck were a pair of boots, a knife, and a bag of rope. It looked like police had found the interstate killer just in time.
Open the door, please.
Eiler was hauled into custody and subjected to a day of intense interrogation. He remained calm and denied having any knowledge of the murders. But while he was being questioned, investigators were busy gathering evidence from the items seized during the arrest. At the crime lab, examiners processed the evidence that had been confiscated. The tires had been taken off of Larry Eiler's pickup truck and were rolled and printed with the hopes of matching the tread to the plaster casts made at one of the interstate killer's crime scenes. Within days, investigators were confident of their findings. It was the news police had expected. The tire tracks matched perfectly, as did the boot prints. Larry Eiler had been at the scene, and now they had the evidence to prove it in court. But the prints only linked Eiler to the area where the body was found. It didn't prove he had killed Ralph Calise. That information was hidden within other items seized from Larry Eiler at his arrest. The soles of Eiler's boots were caked with dried blood. It matched the blood of Ralph Calise. A knife found in the truck also showed minuscule traces of his blood. With such conclusive evidence, investigators were sure they had their man. They charged Larry Eiler with the murder of Ralph Calise and set about preparing for the trial. It looked like the end of the interstate killer. It wasn't. All the evidence amounted to nothing.
Evidence was thrown out because of what's known as the exclusionary rule, the fruit of the poisonous tree. You can't illegally seize evidence and then use it against somebody.
Apparently, the sergeant answering the officer's call mistook the routine surveillance alert out on Eiler for a detention order. He had been arrested unjustly. Even in the face of indisputable forensic evidence, nothing could stick unless the proper procedures had been followed. The bloody knife, the boots, and the tire track were ruled inadmissible. Eiler was released. Police would have to start over. Eiler was guilty and he was free. All that authorities could do was helplessly watch and wait until he tried to kill again. The Illinois police attempted to maintain surveillance on Larry Eiler, not only to prevent another murder, but also hoping that he would slip up and leave behind some evidence they could use. But constant surveillance was impossible.
People can say that, well, why didn't the police watch him? There's no way that we can put, men around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week watching somebody. It's almost impossible to do. While people are going around their normal, everyday life. We couldn't do it. So it was a matter of when was Larry going to kill again? And Danny Bridges was our answer.
In August of 1984, a janitor at a Chicago apartment building watched a man from a neighboring building dump some garbage bags into the wrong dumpster. This had happened too many times before, and the janitor took it upon himself to remove the bags from his building's trash receptacle. But as he lifted the bag, it tore, exposing the horror within. A human leg protruded through the plastic. When police responded, they recognized the address of Eiler's apartment building right next door. The trash bags contained the dismembered body of a young man identified as Danny Bridges. Even though this was not the interstate killer's style, authorities were certain the bags would eventually lead back to Eiler. The trash bags were sent to the forensics lab at the Chicago Police Department. Forensic investigator James Doran was in charge of the examination.
We paid particular attention to the plastic bags in which the dismembered body parts were in. And the reason for that is we felt if we could develop any type of impression or a latent fingerprint on here, we could tie this up to a suspect.
The bags were fumed to bring out any prints. Doran discovered several perfect sets. To no one's surprise, they belonged to Larry Eiler. Investigators had him once again, right where they wanted him. This time they were meticulous. The evidence was unquestionable. All procedures had been followed.
Yeah, well, I think the one that we
Eiler's
found in the
interstate
bag,
reign of terror
the plastic
was
bag
over,
on the inside, I think that's
or
a
so
real
he
good
thought.
All right. Bye.
When Eiler was questioned, he explained that he'd thrown some things in the dumpster and had to move a few bags to make room. Apparently, he said, he must have moved the body bags. Authorities knew he was lying, but the truth was, anyone could have touched those bags once they were in the dumpster. His simple alibi was airtight. Once again, it looked like the interstate killer was going to walk away scot-free. Hoping to bag a killer, the trash bags that contained the body parts were fumed for fingerprints again, this time on the inside. There, in one of the bags, forensic expert James Doran found a single print left by Larry Eiler.
I mean, there are no two people in this world with the same fingerprints to date. And unless Larry Eiler could explain away why he had his thumbprint, fingerprint, on the inside of that bag containing a part of Danny Bridges, we had the person who killed Danny Bridges.
Armed with a single fingerprint, police arrested Eiler at his apartment and charged him with the murder of Danny Bridges. Once more, authorities had Eiler in custody, but this time they were going to make sure that he wasn't released. Every inch of the apartment would need to be examined in order to build a foolproof case to take to court. Initially, investigators found the apartment virtually spotless. But as they began to probe, they uncovered pieces of a puzzle that told of a grisly murder. The story of Danny Bridges' death was found in bits of evidence collected throughout the apartment. An awl discovered in the bedroom was found to have small traces of human blood on it. Although the samples were too minute to match to the victim, investigators felt it was probably the weapon that caused the punctures found in his body. The frame of a hacksaw that detectives believe was used to cut up the body was also found to contain traces of human blood. But again, it wasn't enough blood to link to Danny Bridges. For such a violent crime to have occurred in such a confined space, authorities were surprised to find the apartment so clean. Detectives supposed that if the body was dismembered in the apartment, the killer would have done it in the bathroom. They took up the threshold, hoping to find some blood that Eiler wouldn't have thought to clean up. Their hunch was right. Underneath the bathroom threshold was enough dried blood to be tested. It was sent to the lab. To get a clearer picture of how the murder transpired, investigators switched off the lights. Luminol is a chemical that glows on contact with even the faintest traces of blood. When detectives sprayed the mixture, the truth shone through. The brutality of the crime left its stains throughout the apartment. Microanalyst Marion Caporuso was responsible for extracting trace evidence at the scene.
When we were doing the luminol processing, although we knew that there was blood at the area, there were none of us that were really prepared for the scope of the amount of blood that was present, the pattern of the wipes. I think there was an audible sigh as we realized that the luminol processing gave us such insight into how the crime scene was actually cleaned up.
The blood samples were analyzed to determine if they matched Danny Bridges or if they were from some other unfortunate victim. At the time, DNA testing was not available.
The type of testing that could be done in the mid-1980s was genetic marker testing. I did an analysis in 6 genetic marker systems and determined that, in fact, the blood under the threshold did match the type of Danny Bridges. That particular combination of types occurred in 3% of the Caucasian population.
That level of precision, coupled with the other evidence, was enough to convict Larry Eiler of murdering Danny Bridges. He was sentenced to death. Eventually, he confessed to killing 22 others over 4 years. On August 21st, 1994, he picked up Danny Bridges outside a bar. But instead of driving to a remote outdoor area, this time Eiler took the young man home. After tying him up, Eiler stabbed and tortured his victim. He had to drag the body to the tub in order to cut it into pieces small enough to dispose of. Blood covered the apartment. Though he'd taken careful measures to clean up, the stains of his guilt were indelible. Even after a serial killer is caught, his motives remain elusive. Experts know only that these murderers are relentless in their drive to kill. Investigators are equally relentless in their mission to stop serial killers. Though the crimes are enormous, success often hinges on a series of tiny clues the killer leaves in his wake. As a young woman slowly grows weaker, a murder investigation gains strength. To solve it, detectives must extract a dark family secret from the grave. A tight circle of friends contracts as, one by one, its members die mysteriously. The circumstances are suspicious, but there's little evidence of murder. When a woman is poisoned to death, her survivors point fingers at each other. To find the killer, investigators must get to the source of the bad blood. Even when its symptoms are dramatic, poison is a subtle menace. The poisoner is a two-faced monster whose loved ones become victims of tainted trust. On September 19, 1979, Marie Hilley rushed to the University of Alabama Hospital in Birmingham. Her 19-year-old daughter, Carol, was very sick. For the past 5 months, she'd suffered severe vomiting, stomach cramps, a deteriorating nervous system, and paralysis in her legs. Her hands became clawed and nearly useless. Marie, a widow who doted on her only daughter, was frantic to find a cure for Carol's grave illness.
Should you be able to hold anything down?
Yeah.
Good.
After months of shuttling Carol from doctor to doctor, seldom leaving her bedside, Marie was at the end of her rope. Doctors told her that Carol might have a virus or some other condition, but she'd yet to get a clear diagnosis about what was crippling her daughter. Carol's illness was taking its toll on Marie as well.
Marie Hilley.
I'm Marie Hilley.
On Carol's first day at the University of Alabama Hospital, a plainclothes police officer came looking for Marie.
Yes, what can I do for you?
He asked if he could speak to her in private.
The truth, I don't really want to talk to you about right here.
Be right back, Carol.
Carol's mounting medical bills were wreaking havoc with Marie's finances. A bank and a furniture store in nearby Anniston filed complaints against her for passing bad checks. The officer served Marie with an arrest warrant. He was taking her to jail. Not wanting to alarm her daughter, Marie made up a story about why she had to leave. Carol had no knowledge of her mom's arrest. The next day, when Carol couldn't reach her mother, she called her Aunt Frida, who came to see her and tell her about Marie. Frida had news for the doctors, too, expressing her concern about Marie's care of Carol. She said that Marie moved Carol from hospital to hospital before the young woman could be properly diagnosed. She also claimed to have witnessed Marie giving Carol shots. She feared that Marie's desperate attempts to heal her daughter were only making her more ill. This possibility made Carol's doctor rethink his diagnosis. Perhaps her illness was caused by a toxin rather than a virus. He realized her symptoms were consistent with heavy metal poisoning, most commonly arsenic. Often called the great imitator, arsenic routinely escapes early diagnosis, masquerading as food poisoning or the flu. The misjudgment could be fatal, according to forensic toxicologist Chip Walls, now lab director at the University of Miami School of Medicine.
In many cases, the chronic poisoning with arsenic has been missed at the early stages, and the person either goes on and either gets better or dies from the chronic poisoning.
Hi, Miss Hilly. We're going to take a nail sample.
But once it's suspected, long-term arsenic poisoning is easy to diagnose. Carol's fingernails displayed the broad white lines called Mees lines that signal the presence of arsenic in the bloodstream for longer than 6 weeks. Following up on this crucial discovery, nail and hair samples were sent to the lab to determine the extent of her poisoning. That would help determine the source of her exposure and how long she'd been exposed. The samples are carefully weighed before they're put into what's called a digesting flask. Nitric and sulfuric acid are mixed with the sample and heated. The digested sample is then ready to be analyzed. Early readings showed high levels of the poison in Carol's samples, but it would take weeks to get more detailed results. Because arsenic is found in nature and is a common ingredient in pesticides, her exposure could have been accidental, but not everyone believed that.
How are you?
While the samples were being tested, Anniston police received a letter from Carol's brother.
Forensic report. I thought you might want to see what that thing looks like. From Hilly's son?
He believed that Marie Hilly may have killed her husband 4 years earlier and was now poisoning her daughter. Lieutenant Gary Carroll, now chief investigator, went to speak with Carol Hilly.
During the interview, Carol had outlined a number of events that had occurred to her beginning sometime, I think, in mid-April of 1979.
Carol explained that within a month she'd endured 2 hospital stays. She enjoyed a brief recovery until August, when her illness took a turn for the worse.
Your doctor gives you?
She told detectives that the change occurred just after she moved from her mother's house to her own apartment.
I brought you something to drink.
Though Carol looked forward to living alone, Marie practically moved in with her from the very first day, keeping house and doing most of the cooking.
So much. Carol, honey, we're ready to go.
Within days, she fell seriously ill, suffering from nausea and severe cramps. Marie rushed her to a hospital where she stayed for a week. But when doctors offered no quick solution, Marie abruptly moved Carol to another hospital. Carol recalled that in September, while she was in the hospital, her mother gave her 2 orange pills and 2 injections. Marie told her daughter they would ease the paralysis in her legs, but still her illness progressed.
Here it goes.
Marie Hilley's behavior prompted Lieutenant Carroll to request the police file on her. He knew that she had been a victim of a series of strange events ever since her husband died. Carroll hoped the files might reveal some pattern.
Back in 1977, our police department had received numerous complaints from Marie Hilley regarding vandalisms, harassing phone calls, burglaries, fires, and etc. Many things going on at her residence.
Marie collected substantial insurance claims for damage to her house, her daughter's car, and her husband Frank's death. Seeing a possible motive, Lieutenant Carroll looked into the status of Carol Hilley's life insurance.
Written with the offhand. Call the coroner about this.
Marie was the beneficiary, but the policy had lapsed.
Okay. I'll meet with you tomorrow.
According to the insurance company, Marie had made several desperate attempts to have it reinstated, but every one of her checks bounced.
Yeah.
Following up on the letter sent by Carol Hilley's brother, Lieutenant Carroll received a copy of Frank Hilley's medical records. Frank and Marie Hilley appeared to be an average happy couple. They were married for 25 years and raised 2 children, Mike and Carol. As her kids were growing up, Marie maintained an active social life. Frank enjoyed his role of the hard-working breadwinner, active, healthy, and rarely missing a day of work.
I'll be right back.
But one evening in May 1975, Frank came home in agony from an upset stomach. He stayed home most of the next week. Marie tended to him around the clock. But Frank's condition worsened rapidly. Within a matter of days, he was dead.
No, don't lift your head.
At the time, the circumstances were considered tragic, but not criminal. And even now, it seemed inconceivable that a woman could be cold-blooded enough to poison her own family. Marie Hilley just didn't fit the mold of murderer. But in hindsight, Frank Hilley's symptoms suggested a classic case of arsenic poisoning. To be sure, investigators needed to exhume his body. It would be easier with Marie's permission.
Yes. With these rights in mind,
She was still in custody for writing bad checks. She denied any involvement in her husband's death
just sign this, please, right here.
and granted permission for his exhumation and autopsy.
The person at the hospital?
When asked about Carol, she denied poisoning her or even giving her medication. But investigators persisted.
Finally, upon being confronted about having given Carol shots, she finally admitted that she did give Carol some shots. She says she got, it was some medication she got from a nurse who worked at one of the hospitals. Case in, please.
But police were unable to locate a nurse matching the name or description Marie gave. 1 week later, authorities exhumed Frank Hilley's body. It's said that dead men tell no tales, but only Frank could tell them if his devoted wife and the mother of his children was a murderer. While investigators in Alabama collected hair and nail samples from Frank Hilley's exhumed remains, the results from Carol Hilley's arsenic testing came back from the lab. The analysis showed abnormal levels of arsenic along the length of her hair, demonstrating long-term exposure to the poison. The hair closest to Carol's scalp had 35 times the amount of arsenic than on the outer part, revealing that she'd received recent high doses. Her mother, Marie Hilly, was still the prime suspect in the slow and painful poisoning of her daughter. All that remained was the proof. It wasn't long in coming. On the morning of October 8th, police received a note from Carol's Aunt Frida, along with a prescription bottle containing a clear liquid. The note said she found the bottle in Marie's jewelry box. Detective Carroll sent the bottle for analysis. A half hour later, the lab confirmed the bottle contained arsenic. A similar vial was taken from Marie's purse when she was first arrested for check bouncing. It appeared empty, but investigators suspected it might hold some residue. They rinsed it with distilled water, then tested the rinse water. Once again, they found arsenic.
Mrs. Hilly, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of your daughter.
On October 9, 1979, Marie Hilly was served with warrants charging her with attempting to poison Carol.
Not make any statement at all. Any statement you make may
Additional warrants were served for passing more bad checks, but these charges paled in comparison to what police still suspected, that Marie Hilly had murdered her husband. Still, they had no proof.
Hire a lawyer. You have the right to have a lawyer appointed.
We had not received any information from the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences on the autopsy results from Frank, so we were awaiting those. And during the meantime, she made bond and got out on the attempt to poison charge and also the 2 check charges.
But Marie could not feel too relieved. The same tests that found arsenic in her daughter's system were being used on samples taken from her late husband, and with much the same result. Frank Hilly had been poisoned. The evidence showed that the poison was taken a little at a time, with a large dose at the end. On January 11, 1980, the Calhoun County Grand Jury indicted Marie Hilly for first-degree murder. Hilly received life plus 20 years for attempting to poison her daughter. But Marie Hilly wound up serving only a fraction of that time. After 3 years, she'd manipulated the warden into trusting her with a 3-day furlough. When it was time for her to return, it was clear that Marie Hilly had escaped. But her getaway didn't last. A week later, she was discovered, apparently trying to break into a house. Her clothes were soaked and she acted delirious. She suffered a massive heart attack and died that evening. Marie Hilly was buried next to her husband Frank, the man she'd poisoned to death. Why would a seemingly devoted wife and mother poison members of her family? Perhaps money was the original motive. But since her daughter Carol's life insurance policy had lapsed, there was no financial reward in killing her. Maybe, in Marie Hilly's mind, murder became its own reward. In that regard, she wasn't alone. On the afternoon of June 28, 1987, Carrie Middleton answered a call to check on 30-year-old Lisa K. Chandler in Odessa, Texas. Lisa had been seriously depressed, and her friends were concerned. Carrie found Lisa in her bedroom, dead. She ran to phone the police, not to call in a suicide, but to report a murder. Police found no evidence of a crime, no forced entry or signs of struggle. In fact, there seemed no cause of death at all.
I need to bag this note. Don, give me a bag to put
On the
this note in.
nightstand lay a scrap of paper with scribbled notes, but it didn't mention suicide or anything else that could be related to Lisa's death.
I'm gonna take this out. Be right back.
A washcloth on the floor had no stains or other visible clues. It seemed the victim had died peacefully and mysteriously in her sleep.
Morning, Gene. How are you this morning?
According to Detective Mickey Brown, now a chief of police, that was reason enough to investigate further.
Thank you. You have a victim here that apparently there's no reason for cause of death, and this is a young female. There's no trauma, so I immediately become suspicious as to what caused this young lady's death.
Out of her mind with grief, Carrie Middleton insisted to police that her friend was murdered. But without any evidence, their best strategy was to wait for the autopsy report.
He told me to check all the police stuff. I know. Look.
Tissue samples were sent to the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine, where forensic toxicologist Gary Wimbish tested them.
We look for the drugs or substances with the highest probability of having an association with the cause of death. For example, ethyl alcohol, carbon monoxide, other volatile substances or alcohols that may have been involved. Drugs of abuse would be high priority, and then second with routine prescription medication.
Blood specimens revealed a high concentration of ethyl alcohol found in wine or beer. Though it may have contributed, the alcohol couldn't have caused Lisa's death on its own. With the victim's death still a mystery, Detective Brown couldn't discount the possibility of foul play. He'd learned from Carrie Middleton that Lisa was in the middle of a bitter divorce from her husband, Kyle. Carrie also said Lisa was having an affair with David Dowler, a mutual friend with an exotic lifestyle.
Well, the more she talked, she got into telling us about Dowler, and it began to read like a Tom Clancy novel. You know, he was claiming to work for the government, to work for the CIA, to be a spy catcher, things of that nature. And she was very sincere in what she was telling us, but it seemed far out at the time.
Because Dowler was the last person to be seen with the victim, an interview was arranged. He was cooperative and seemed friendly and personable. Dowler claimed Carrie was mistaken about his work for the CIA. But he did share the opinion that Lisa Chandler was a victim of foul play. He also had an idea who her killer was, Kyle Chandler, Lisa's husband. He said Kyle was furious that she was cheating on him.
Good morning.
Kyle Chandler was next on the list to be interviewed. Fearing he was the prime suspect in his wife's death, Chandler brought his lawyer with him. Kyle also felt that Lisa was murdered, but he pointed the finger back at his accuser, David Dowler.
The names of your closest friends that you and Lisa had? I'm Juan. How are you?
Hi, Juan.
Kyle Chandler portrayed Dowler as an unusual man with a sinister edge. He owned and operated a one-hour photo shop, but claimed that was only a cover for his real job as a CIA agent. As a government insider, Dowler claimed he knew in advance which friends were in danger. He seemed to be right. According to Kyle Chandler, Dowler knew more than he was letting on about the death of Lisa Chandler and the unexplained deaths of two of their other friends. The investigation into Lisa Chandler's death was taking an unexpected turn. When Detective Mickey Brown looked back over the files, he discovered that Lisa Chandler was the third of her circle of friends to die mysteriously. And in each case, David Dowler was mentioned as one of the last people to see the victim alive. 4 years before the death of Lisa Chandler, another of Dowler's girlfriends met a similar fate. Lisa Craig was found lying as if she'd died in her sleep. There were no signs of forced entry into her home, nor any signs of trauma on her body. The only suspicious things were notes scribbled in the margins of her Bible. Craig believed someone wanted to kill her. Craig had a history of anorexia nervosa. An autopsy found no other evidence, so the medical examiner concluded she died as a result of that condition. However, since there was no specific cause of death, he left her file open and saved her tissue samples.
Hi, ma'am. How are you today? What can I
3
do for
years
you?
later, the next to die was Dowler's business partner, Juan Casillas. After Dowler was laid off from his job at an oil company, he and Casillas opened a photo store together. In 1986, Kyle Chandler found Casillas at his home, dead on the kitchen floor. The autopsy revealed an unidentified substance in his tissues. Samples were saved according to hospital policy, but no cause of death was determined. Detective Brown now wondered if Kyle Chandler did more than just discover Juan Casillas' death. He began to think that maybe he caused it. Brown learned that Juan Casillas was married to Lisa Chandler before Kyle married her. First, Casillas died, and now Lisa was dead too. That gave Kyle Chandler a direct connection to 2 of the 3 mysterious deaths in his tight circle of friends. But Kyle Chandler wasn't the only suspect. In each of the 3 deaths, David Dowler made the phone call that led to the body being discovered. Detective Brown had 3 deaths and 2 likely suspects. He needed help sorting them out. He remembered an offer made to him by Carrie Middleton concerning David Dowler. She was convinced Dowler was the killer, living out some deranged fantasy. She wanted the chance to prove it.
During the interview with Carrie, I expressed some reservations to her about the story that she was telling me, and she voluntarily said that she would be more than happy to wear a microphone or a wire where I could firsthand listen to David Dowler telling her these stories.
David Dowler may have pretended to be a government agent, but Carrie Middleton was about to do some real undercover work.
Not everybody.
Okay.
True to her word, she agreed to wear a wire so that police could hear her conversations with David Dowler.
Yeah, let me help you. Relax. Okay, let's make sure it doesn't show up.
Detective Mickey Brown also had surveillance cameras set up in Carrie's apartment so police could watch them.
Hear me through this?
Yes, make sure.
We'll test it before you go in.
Put a couple buttons in so it doesn't.
Brown knew that time spent here would either help the investigation or take him down the entirely wrong road.
We had a total of 16 hours of recordings on him on about 3 occasions. He totally dominated the conversations. He talked constantly.
Most of the talk was idle banter. But in one of these conversations, he described how to murder someone by putting chloroform in their car ventilation. Then he outlined a likely method the killer would have used to kill Lisa Chandler with chloroform. Dowler offered detailed descriptions of how Lisa Craig and Juan Casillas were probably murdered using cyanide. And he told Carey he was afraid she might be next. These were either the veiled confessions of a mad serial killer, the ramblings of a man desperate for attention, or both. His own words made Dowler the prime suspect. But the proof of those words had to be verified in the lab. Tissue samples from Lisa Craig and Juan Casillas were sent to Gary Wimbish to test for cyanide.
The test that we employed to assay for the cyanide actually is a testing protocol that is not ancient, but certainly has been around for a while, called a Conway diffusion cell.
It's a simple device that holds a blood sample in one compartment, a trapping solution in the center, and sulfuric acid on the other side. The container is then sealed and rotated so that the blood and acid mix. The acid releases the cyanide from the blood in its gaseous form, which is then trapped by the solution in the center compartment. The solution changes color to indicate how much cyanide is present.
We found rather large amounts of cyanide present in the blood specimens of Casillas and Craig. The concentrations were about 7 to 10 times the amount that are often found in lethal cases.
The results were indisputable. Both Craig and Casillas were killed with cyanide. To test Lisa Chandler, Wimbish used a gas chromatograph to detect traces of chloroform. A microscopic tissue sample was placed into the apparatus, which was calibrated to show the unique spectroscopic fingerprint of chlorine compounds.
This is the internal standard, and this is where
the test revealed that Lisa Chandler had enough chloroform in her system to kill 7 people.
All right, good.
Unmasked by his own incessant conversation, the real David Dowler was finally revealed.
And then once we verified through the post-mortem and the toxicology results that this was in fact how the victims had died, we knew then that we had our predator. We knew who we had then.
David Dowler wasn't a concerned friend or a government agent, but a very sick and dangerous serial killer. Armed with the toxicology reports and information gathered from surveillance, Detective Brown secured a warrant for Dowler's residence. But he wasn't through yet. He wanted to be sure he had enough to win this case. He hoped for a confession, if not to police, then to Carey Middleton.
We decided to tape one more conversation to try to obtain as much evidence as possible.
By going through with another meeting, Brown was using his key witness as live bait for a known killer. Carey was putting her life on the line. By now, Dowler might have suspected she was talking to police. Even with officers just outside, she'd be on her own if Dowler moved in quickly with a knife or gun. As an extra precaution, Detective Brown wired Carey's entire home and had additional police standing by just in case. That evening, when Dowler came to Carey's home, the two spoke amiably at first, concentrating on small talk. Then, Dowler began talking about how the police were bungling the investigation into Lisa Chandler's death. He mentioned that he kept a pistol in his car, and once again told Carey that she was in danger. Then, he suddenly announced he had to leave for a moment, but that he'd be right back. That was enough for Detective Brown. Not wanting to risk Carey's life any further, he had his officers move in and arrest Dowler in his car. From the evidence retrieved at the scene, Detective Brown may have acted just in time.
We arrested Dowler shortly after he left the witness's residence, and we found in his possession a pistol, a silencer, ammunition. We also found some lockpick sets and ski mask that he had.
These suspicious articles couldn't begin to suggest the vast and deadly arsenal Dowler had at his disposal. At his house, detectives uncovered explosives, blasting caps, crude eavesdropping equipment, more homemade gun silencers, and chemicals used to make explosives and poison. The police needed a truck to haul it all away. Dowler's lab was the incubator for 3 murders. Mixing chemicals into a lethal brew, he was able to concoct his deadly schemes. He denied killing Lisa Chandler and told investigators he was only trying to help her.
I was just honest about what really bothered me.
First, he said he had her write down questions about their relationship. Then he said he would help her find a hypnotic state by pouring chloroform into a washcloth that was covering her face. According to Dowler, she would then be able to answer her own questions with her subconscious.
Get comfortable.
He said that she was getting tired, so he left.
Yeah.
Dowler claimed she must have taken more chloroform herself to commit suicide. Investigators didn't believe it. No bottle of chloroform was found at the scene. The forensics report also proved Dowler's story couldn't be true.
That couldn't have happened because when Dr. Wimbish did the toxicology, she had 7 times the toxic amount in her system, and she would have been sound asleep long before she could have self-administered that much chloroform to her.
Dowler had administered the fatal dose. He may have lived a fantasy life as a secret agent, but he played the real-life role of murderer. In January 1988, David Dowler was sentenced to life in prison for the death of Lisa Chandler. Because he received the highest possible penalty, he was not tried for the other 2 murders he is suspected of. David Dowler killed for the sake of killing. In Little Rock, Arkansas, investigators found that poison was just one part of a killer's elaborate master plan. Georgia Weaver had recently come to live with her sister, Jeannie Allen. When Jeannie had told her younger sister that her cozy home had become too much for her to manage by herself, Georgia was happy to move in and help out. On December 19th, 1992, Jeannie was struck with a sudden, intense illness. Georgia, who also felt ill, rushed her sister to the hospital. For 2 weeks, doctors puzzled over the root of her symptoms, thinking it might be food poisoning. When her condition worsened, they ordered tests for heavy metal poisoning. The results showed Jeannie had nearly 20 times the normal amount of arsenic in her system. Intentionally or by accident, Jeannie Allen was being poisoned. Jeannie's son, Jerry Allen, reacted to the news by going to the police. He was certain his mother's poisoning was no accident. He told them that the situation wasn't always so rosy between his mother and his aunt, Georgia Weaver. Detective Steve Moore listened to Jerry Allen's story.
He told us that they had been involved in a dispute in years past over a inheritance from their mother who had died, and apparently Miss Weaver had spent some of the money without Miss Allen's knowledge.
The sisters hadn't spoken to each other for 4 years. Jeannie had only recently decided to make amends and invite Georgia back into her life. Jeannie was lonely. Her husband, James Allen, was incapacitated with a stroke, and her kids were grown. Georgia began spending the night at Jeannie's house and cooking all of the meals. But Jerry believed that Georgia was scheming to take financial advantage of his mother once again.
Need more pop? No.
3 months before Jeannie fell ill, Jerry confronted Georgia at his mother's house, triggering a tremendous argument. Georgia called the police to have Jerry removed from the premises. Bad blood clearly flowed within the family, but there was little to link it with Jeannie's current condition.
When Jerry Allen first came to us, we were concerned about, were we getting in the middle of a family squabble? Was there really a crime here? Was there really something we needed to be involved in?
But 2 days after Jerry filed his report, Jeannie Allen died from arsenic poisoning. Now the police had to get involved. Though it was still uncertain if Jeannie's poisoning was intentional, the death needed to be investigated. Police began by interviewing Jeannie's friends and family members.
Thank you.
Certainly. Something to eat?
No, thank you.
One of the first was Georgia Weaver.
All right, what can I help you with?
Cordial and friendly, her anger rose when she talked about her nephew, Jerry Allen.
Oh, I don't have arsenic in the house. You can't...
Georgia told police that Jerry resented her because Jeannie trusted her more. She claimed that if anyone poisoned Jeannie, it would be Jerry, who was jockeying to gain control of Jeannie Allen's money. Investigators now had 2 suspects, and yet they weren't even certain a crime had been committed. Before they could determine that, they had to determine how long Jeannie Allen had been exposed to the arsenic and how she had consumed it. To find out if Jeannie Allen had been intentionally poisoned, investigators examined her hair. The arsenic leaves a record along the growing strands. The hair samples are cut into segments, then wrapped securely in a paper form that establishes the chain of evidence. Because plastic bags could contaminate biological samples, labs use paper wrapping. Each segment is individually tested for arsenic. The duration of a person's exposure can be determined by seeing how much of the hair contains the poison. According to criminalist Gary Lawrence, it is not uncommon to find arsenic in any hair sample.
Most people have a normal background level of arsenic within the body. And if they receive from some form an amount of arsenic that's abnormal to the body, I think the system has a way of working some of that out.
If the arsenic were in the environment, investigators would expect to find minute traces along the length of the hair. If the poison were administered intentionally, it would usually appear as one big dose on the portion of hair closest to the scalp.
I don't believe it's very easy to hide arsenic poisoning. It can be done, but again, even when you get up to the long-term dosages, even at low levels, the buildup of the arsenic within the body is eventually going to show up.
The report showed normal trace levels of arsenic along most of the length of the hair. But on the segment closest to the scalp, the hair contained 13 times the normal amount of the poison. The results suggested that Jeannie Allen's death was no accident.
Let's get everything out of this closet.
To find the source of the arsenic, police conducted a search of her house and confiscated all of the food and medicine they could find. About 100 items in all. At the Arkansas State Crime Lab, each sample was bombarded with X-rays in a technique called X-ray fluorescence. Electrons in the samples become excited, giving off specific levels of energy. The lab looked for energy levels characteristic of arsenic. The lab tests for the samples taken from Jeannie Allen's home would take several months to complete.
What's the problem?
There's some very strange things going on in this house.
In the meantime, police conducted interviews with her
All of a
neighbors.
sudden, Georgia won't let me see her. I went
It
for
wasn't
Georgia's
long
house.
before they narrowed their list of
It's just
suspects
very
from
strange.
2
I understand
to
that there's
1.
missing, that she's supposed to have.
Many neighbors said that mysterious changes occurred once Georgia Weaver moved in. Jeannie Allen came outside less and less. Georgia collected the mail and ran errands. Jeannie soon stopped calling her friends. And when they tried to get in touch with her, Georgia was always there, blocking the way.
If somebody went over there or called over there, Georgia answered the phone, Georgia came to the door, and they never saw Jeannie again. It was like she didn't exist, basically. Georgia checked the mail. Georgia basically took over the household, which made me suspicious that a grown lady that was not in any medical condition at that time, no senility or anything, would just let somebody take over their home like that.
As suspicions began focusing on Georgia Weaver, investigators uncovered more to incriminate her. On December 22nd, just days after Jeannie Allen was admitted to the hospital, Georgia went to the bank and, using a power of attorney, closed Jeannie Allen's account. She took $1,300 and the contents of her safe deposit box. Georgia was arrested at her job in a local motel. In her possession was about $1,000, Jeannie Allen's car, a credit card, and her power of attorney. Upon closer inspection, investigators noticed an odd detail about the power of attorney.
Yeah, see if you know these guys in there.
On this document, legally handing Jeannie's rights to Georgia Weaver, both Jeannie Allen's printed name and signature were misspelled. In order to get a true sample of Georgia's signature, police had her sign her name and Jeannie's several times in front of witnesses.
Oh, no, we're not finished yet.
The signatures were sent to the Arkansas State Crime Lab for analysis. Jeannie Allen's known signature was compared with Georgia's version of the signature. The differences went beyond the spelling errors, according to Dawn Reed, Chief of Questioned Documents.
There were pressure habits that were extremely different. Extreme differences were noted between the spacing habits of the writer on the question document and the known handwriting of Jeannie Allen. The uppercase J was a two-stroke J that Jeannie Allen usually wrote, and on the question document it was very flourished.
But when Reed compared the signatures written by Georgia Weaver to the one on the power of attorney, she knew she caught the forger hands down.
I positively identified Georgia Weaver as writing Jeannie Allen's signature on the power of attorney, which is totally conclusive. There was no qualified opinion. She wrote that. The probability that any other individual could have is nil.
Georgia was arrested for theft and forgery. She may have been a killer, too, if investigators could only prove it. Georgia Weaver posted bond for her arrests on theft and forgery, but her troubles weren't over. A few weeks later, she was charged with stealing employee checks from the motel where she worked and forging the signatures on them. She was arrested again. Though she was proving to be a thief and a forger, investigators had nothing to tie her to the murder of her sister, Jeannie Allen. Then, a co-worker reported finding a bottle of rat poison hidden where Georgia always kept her purse. It wasn't a brand the motel used. It was sent to the police and passed on to the Arkansas State Crime Lab for analysis. The active ingredient was arsenic. This evidence, tangible but circumstantial, was the first to link Georgia to the poison. Now, investigators needed to link the source of the poison to her sister. In August 1993, the extensive tests on items from Jeannie Allen's home were complete. Arsenic was discovered in 2 containers of punch and a bottle of cold medicine. The link was established. Detective Moore only hoped it was strong enough.
At that point, I felt we had what we needed to bring her to justice. We knew that it would be a battle as far as getting her convicted, but we didn't feel that we had any other choice but to try to get her put in prison where we felt she belonged.
From the evidence, investigators surmised that after ingratiating herself with her sister, Georgia began spiking her medicine and beverages with the rat poison she kept hidden at her workplace, finally killing her with one big dose. On May 4th, 1994, Georgia Weaver was convicted of the capital murder of her sister, Jeannie Allen.
I believe what motivated Georgia was greed, power, and also probably a motivational fact was that she wanted what Jeannie had as far as a home, a family, the financial stability that she had, whereas Georgia was alone, out of money. And I believe that maybe that she saw that's the only way she could get what that had was to take this route.
But the route she took proved to be a dead end. Georgia Weaver was sentenced to life in prison with no parole and is currently serving at the Arkansas Department of Corrections. The act of poisoning begins with a simple premise. The poisoner believes he can hide his guilt behind a mask of concern. But time and again, forensics has proven this premise false. In small-town Maine, police pursue the killer of a young mother for 20 years, waiting for technology to match their perseverance. A student disappears on his way to class.
Bye.
A ransom is demanded. Is it a kidnapping, con game, or something far more sinister? Detectives in Washington State must find a way to outsmart a killer who knows their every move before he slips through their fingers. Murders of passion can often lead investigators straight to a killer. But when the clues are few and the leads tenuous, detectives know they are searching for something emotionless. A killer who is cold-blooded. Norridgewock, Maine, November 23, 1976. Police discover a car in the bushes near River Road. The engine still running. There was no one in sight. The officer called in the license plate number. The dispatcher said the car had been reported missing by the owner, Vaughn Stevens. Stevens claimed that his girlfriend had borrowed the car earlier in the evening to do some shopping, but had not returned. Inside the vehicle, the officer discovered blood on the passenger seat. Vaughn Stevens was contacted and asked to respond to the scene. The officer continued to examine the vehicle. Inside the trunk, partially covered by a jacket, he discovered the body of a woman. She was wearing only a pair of socks. Homicide investigations in rural areas fall to the state police. After being notified, investigators began to scour the area for clues. When Vaughn Stevens arrived with a friend, he positively identified his car. His friend had to identify the victim in the trunk. She was Stevens' girlfriend, 30-year-old Janet Baxter. Distraught, Stevens was allowed to leave the scene. Maine State Police Detective Chick Love continued his investigation.
In the car, we found the groceries that she had purchased at the store that night. We found the sales slip, the cash register tape that told us what store she was in and exactly what time that she was there.
The coroner's autopsy revealed Janet Baxter had been shot in the head and chest with bullets from a .22 caliber handgun. She had also been raped. Biological evidence from her body was preserved for testing on glass slides known as slide mailers. The bullets and slide mailers were sent to the crime lab for further analysis. The car Janet had been driving also underwent a thorough investigation. Forensics experts dusted the exterior and discovered a set of latent fingerprints. In the trunk, a single hair was retrieved. Later examination showed it did not belong to Baxter. Hoping to find witnesses, detectives began canvassing the area near River Road. One resident, Clarice Merrill, said she had seen something odd the night before. While driving home, Merrill saw two vehicles pull off the road at the same location where Janet Baxter's body was later found. One of the cars was a yellow Volkswagen. Merrill believed the other car was a Ford LTD. Inside, she saw a man and a woman. The woman appeared to be asleep. Merrill helped create a composite drawing of the man in the LTD, while police began making efforts to locate the yellow bug. In most murder cases, spouses and significant others are always considered suspects. The victim's boyfriend, Vaughn Stevens, was questioned in depth the next day. He agreed to take a polygraph test. He told police that Janet Baxter worked as a nurse and had recently been through a bitter divorce. She had custody of her daughter, Julie.
Let me help you with that. You got that?
Around 9:30, Janet decided to go to the store. Stevens' car was blocking the driveway. He gave her his keys.
All right.
Janet said she would be back in a few minutes.
Around midnight, she didn't show up.
When she failed to return, he phoned police. The polygraph test indicated Stevens was telling the truth. Detectives also questioned Baxter's ex-husband,
We're investigating a homicide that happened on November 29th.
but he had a solid alibi, and like Stevens, he was dismissed as a suspect.
I was working that evening.
Investigators continued searching the area for a yellow Volkswagen.
Can I help you? Good evening. I'm Detective Chick Love. I'd like to ask you a few questions.
A local resident, Galen Lessard, owned a similar car.
I'm not involved in this.
When questioned, he was uncooperative and refused to be interviewed.
No, you got the wrong person. You need to see someone else. Okay, bye.
Investigators probed Lessard's background. Though nothing in his records indicated he was capable of murder, investigators learned he was friends with other men in town. Their records told a different story. One was a suspect in the murder of a college co-ed 5 years earlier. Another slightly resembled the composite drawing Merrill had helped police assemble. But none of these men would talk to authorities. The investigation threatened to turn cold. On November 28th, almost a week since the murder, an officer noticed a white sedan parked at exactly the same spot where Janet Baxter's body was found. A man was standing outside the car. He appeared to be looking for something. The officer noted the registration and passed it along. Investigators ran a check on the plates and learned the car belonged to a man named Albert Cochran. A background check revealed that Cochran had done prison time in Illinois after pleading guilty to murdering his wife in 1964.
Any different
Despite a sentence of 50 to 75 years, he was paroled after 12 years. In early 1976, his parole was transferred to the same town in Maine where Janet Baxter lived. Cochran was brought in for questioning.
You observed that crime scene last night?
He claimed that on the night of the murder, he was smoking marijuana and drinking with 3 strangers in the parking lot of a local bar.
On my way back.
They invited him to a party, but he didn't want to leave his car near the bar, so he moved it to a supermarket parking lot. The same one Janet Baxter had visited the night she was murdered. Cochran said he got in the stranger's car, but made them pull over and let him out when he became suspicious of them. He claimed he then walked several miles to his brother's home in Norridgewock. On the way, he stated he saw police gathered at an area off of River Road.
Your hair, if you don't mind looking that over.
Though he refused to take a polygraph, investigators obtained fingerprints and samples of his hair for comparison with previously gathered evidence.
Just relax.
Cochran's fingerprints were examined and compared to those lifted from the exterior of the car in which Baxter was found. His hair sample was compared against the hair found in the car's trunk. Neither the prints nor the hair samples produced a match. There was no hard evidence pointing to Cochran as the murderer. The investigation hit an impasse. For the next 20 years, the case was passed down through dozens of detectives, each one running into the brick wall presented by the lack of hard evidence. It seemed Janet Baxter's death would never be solved. But her family refused to let it go. "20 years had passed since the murder of 30-year-old Janet Baxter in the small New England town of Norridgewock, Maine. During those years, no arrests had been made. Robert McCleary, Janet Baxter's father, was determined to keep the case alive, no matter how long it took to solve. Every year on the anniversary of his daughter's death, he would call police headquarters.
My desire to continue my contact with the state police was deeply motivated by my desire to see that somebody paid for what they had done to Jan. That somebody was not going to get away with murder, and that to continue to seek the information, to continue the investigation, and to give us some sense of closure.
In 1996, the case was handed over to Maine State Police Detective Mike Mitchell. After reviewing the case files, Mitchell paid a visit to Janet Baxter's parents.
Detective Mike Mitchell.
How do you do?
State Police.
The detective had grown up near Norridgewock and had been in elementary school when the murder occurred.
Well, Mr. McClary, Mrs. McClary, I'm a detective with the Maine State Police, and I just want
He promised he would do everything in his power to solve this case.
If you have any questions of me, don't, don't hesitate to call.
Mitchell began by retracing the steps of the previous investigations. He was struck by the loose ends presented by the owner of the yellow Volkswagen, Galen Lessard, and his cronies, who refused to talk to police. Despite those unresolved issues, he decided to take another crack at Albert Cochran.
Some detectives felt that Albert Patrick Cochran was a suspect and was the person responsible for the murder of Janet Baxter. Some detectives felt that it was another group of people that socialized together. So what I did is I took down all the names of all possible suspects that hadn't been alibied, not to have been in the area at the time, and listed them all down on a piece of paper, and by priority as to who looked like a better suspect than the others. And Albert Patrick Cochran was on the top of the list.
To make his case, Mitchell first had to inventory what evidence had survived over the years. He contacted Maine State Police forensic chemist Chris Montagna.
My other two roles were to see what was still around as far as evidence that had survived 20 years, and second, to reconstruct the notes and the work that had been done 20 years earlier and try and piece all of that together and link it to a suspect that Detective Mitchell was working on as the murderer of Janet Baxter. Now let's see what we've got.
Searching through the boxes of evidence, investigators found the original slide mailers. One looked blank, but was thought to possibly contain swabs of biological evidence from the victim's body. If the evidence had remained intact, it might be possible to extract DNA, a technique not in existence 20 years before. Under the microscope, the slides surprised everyone, revealing the presence of biological evidence removed from Janet Baxter.
So both of them have a lot of sperm. This one, oh wow, I see them. Now, the number of...
Now, investigators needed to find a DNA sample from Cochran. They did not have to go far to find what they needed. The sample of Cochran's hair collected in 1976 was also preserved in the file. But would the hair have viable material for DNA testing? Forensic DNA specialist David Munich was given the assignment.
These head hair samples were known head hair samples. When they're collected, they're actually plucked from the head, and they have skin attached to the hair root, as opposed to hairs that are cut or hairs that just naturally fall out of your head.
Both samples provided ample material to perform the DNA tests. When the tests were concluded and the comparisons made, the results were overwhelming. The DNA tests showed there was only one chance in 37 billion that Janet Baxter's killer was somebody other than Albert Cochran. Munich called Detective Mitchell with the news.
When it came back a perfect match, I can remember I was driving down the road, I picked up my car phone, and I just couldn't believe it. My eyes filled up with water thinking that it was, you know, something you'll never forget.
Any idea of the date of birth?
It's going to be in March. I'm going to think March 17th, 1938, maybe. He's about 62 years old. Is this something?
But where was Albert Cochran?
What's the last name?
Cochran. C-O-C-H-R-A-N.
Computer checks tracked him down to an address in Stuart, Florida. On the morning of March 17, 1998, Detective Mitchell and Florida police arrested Cochran at his home. He was extradited to Maine to stand trial for the murder of Janet Baxter. Based on the evidence gathered over 21 years earlier, detectives believe Cochran had seen Janet Baxter alone in a deserted grocery store parking lot. His prior history of violence reasserting itself, Cochran seized the opportunity to abduct his victim, later raping and killing her. On May 20th, 1999, it took a jury only 2.5 hours to find Albert Cochran guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison, this time without the possibility of parole. Murder is not the only cold-blooded crime. In South Dakota, a mother's only son is held for ransom. Aberdeen, South Dakota, May 8, 1985. 20-year-old Michael Kinney left the home he shared with his mother, Sandra McNeil, to attend classes at Northern State College.
Yeah, I've been working hard on it.
All right, I'll be back.
Okay.
Bye.
When Michael didn't return by the following morning, his mother became concerned. She decided to look for her son. Near the house, she found Michael's car parked on the side of the road. Michael was nowhere in sight. Sandra McNeil contacted the sheriff's office. Brown County Sheriff Mark Milbrandt was assigned to look into the disappearance.
We had some concerns due to the fact that Michael Kinney's car was found across the roadway from his residence and had been parked there for, we're assuming, anywhere from 24 to probably 35 hours, 36.
The following day, Sandra McNeil received a mysterious phone call from an unidentified man. The caller told her to go to a bar in Aberdeen later that evening and look for an envelope under the payphone if she wanted to find out what happened to her son. She was told not to contact the police. Kinney's mother went to the bar and found an envelope hidden beneath the payphone. Inside was a ransom note demanding $200,000 in exchange for her son. Despite the kidnapper's warning, Sandra McNeil gave the note to sheriff's investigators, who examined it for clues. South Dakota Department of Criminal Investigations agent Doug Lake was brought in to assist with the investigation. His first priority was to deal with the difficulties of obtaining the money.
The ransom money was the victim's mother's money, and it was on Friday after the bank is closed, and the agents, the investigators, went around to the different banks in town and gathered up all the cash that they had on hand.
Go ahead. 3 days after her son disappeared, Kinney's mother received a second phone call.
Hello?
This time, investigators were listening.
Is my son okay?
Sandra McNeil was instructed to leave the money in Aberdeen Park at 9 p.m. Investigators traced the call to a public phone box, but the kidnapper hung up and disappeared before the police could close in. The phone had been wiped clean of prints.
Okay, Melgar Park. Just a minute. Mike, all right? He's fine. Can I talk to him? Until I get to mine.
Investigators studied the tape. The caller stated Michael was not hurt, but refused to allow him to talk to his mother until the ransom was paid. The kidnapper described Michael's clothing to authenticate his threat. Investigators felt they had no choice but to follow the kidnapper's demands. The money for the ransom was bundled and placed into a briefcase. Investigators also placed a hidden tracking device inside. An undercover female police officer made the ransom drop as scheduled. A short while later, the briefcase was retrieved by a man who then ran off with more than he bargained for. Police quickly followed. The suspect drove to a residence where he parked the blue Oldsmobile he was driving, transferred the briefcase containing the ransom money to an orange Camaro, and was joined by an unidentified female from inside the residence. Led by the tracking device, agents followed the suspects across the Minnesota border. Just inside Minnesota, a roadblock halted the suspect's flight. They were ordered out of their car and arrested. The driver was identified as 19-year-old Todd Miller. The passenger was his 17-year-old sister. Agents retrieved the briefcase from the Camaro's trunk.
We got something here.
The car was closely examined for clues, but there was no sign of Michael Kinney or any other leads to his whereabouts.
I'm telling you the truth.
Investigators questioned the suspect separately. After a thorough interrogation, investigators found that Miller's sister genuinely appeared to have no clue about Kinney's disappearance or the ransom money. She was released. Todd Miller told police a drug dealer named Bob Jacobs had asked him to pick up a package and deliver it to him in Minnesota. Miller claimed that in return, Jacobs had promised to help him financially. When asked if he knew Kinney, Miller said he was a good friend, but he had no idea Jacobs' job was in any way related to Kinney's disappearance. Miller's story provided investigators with an opportunity. They would use him in a sting operation to nab the drug dealer. The ransom money was returned to him, and he was transported to the pre-arranged delivery point. Jacobs never appeared. Detectives brought Miller back to the police station. The following day, Miller admitted that Jacobs' story was a lie. The kidnapping had been a hoax. Claiming it was all Michael Kinney's idea, Miller explained he had helped stage the entire plot. Miller said he had been friends with Kinney since high school. Alleging Kinney dabbled in various drugs and wanted to move to Canada, Miller stated he was recruited into the kidnapping scam as a way to help Kinney finance his planned relocation. Detectives put Miller through an extensive polygraph test.
Did you harm Michael
The results
Kinney?
of the test were inconclusive, but tended to show the overall truthfulness of his statements.
Todd Miller?
That meant Michael Kinney was alive and on the run. A warrant was issued for his arrest.
Do you live at 123
Police in South Dakota continued their search for 20-year-old Michael Kinney. What had initially appeared to be a kidnapping was now starting to look like a deception.
have anything to do with the disappearance?
Kinney's friend, Todd Miller, claimed to be a reluctant participant in helping Michael Kinney stage his own disappearance and extort his mother.
As well as well-read.
As the result of Miller's story, a warrant was issued for Kinney's arrest.
This is where the
but his whereabouts remained a mystery. Detectives questioned Kinney's girlfriend. She told them she was with Michael the night before he was reported missing. He had dropped her off at her house after they had been out for a pizza and soda. She had not seen or heard from him since. Weeks later, an Aberdeen farmer made a startling discovery. After noticing a foul odor coming from an unused ice house on his property, he entered the building. There, he found a body. Police were immediately called to the scene. Though the body was badly decomposed, investigators found evidence of 3 bullet wounds and what appeared to be blunt trauma injuries to the victim's head. The farmer had no idea who the victim was or how the body ended up in the ice house. Through dental matches, police would soon learn the victim's identity. They had found Michael Kinney.
It was a big impact on us. You know, all of a sudden we went from a possible theft by deception warrant to a kidnapping murder, a homicide.
At the autopsy, the cause of death was determined to be a bullet wound to the aorta. Fibers, perhaps from a rug, were collected from the victim's clothing. It was estimated he had been dead for 2 to 3 weeks, possibly from the time of his disappearance. With Michael Kinney dead, the investigation shifted back to Todd Miller. For investigators, it was clear that he was the killer. But now they had to prove it. To determine if he had written the ransom note, he was returned to the police station to provide handwriting samples. While waiting for those results, warrants to search Miller's cars were obtained. Investigators discovered that the blue Oldsmobile Miller used to pick up the ransom money had been recently washed. However, detectives managed to find 2 hairs that had survived the cleaning. Fiber samples from the trunk were also collected. Next, the interior of the trunk was treated with luminol. This process revealed evidence of blood, but the samples were too deteriorated for analysis. The evidence was hand-delivered to State Crime Lab analyst Rex Reese for comparison. Reese compared fibers removed from Kinney's clothing to those removed from the trunk of Miller's vehicle.
There was an association of the fibers that comprise the liner in the trunk and present as loose fibers on the metal part or the base bottom of the trunk itself. These were black rayon synthetic textile fibers that comprise this liner. Present on Mr. Kinney's clothing were a number of these same type of black fibers.
Though the analysis was incriminating, it was only circumstantial. Investigators needed hard evidence that Michael Kinney had been in the trunk of Miller's car. Reese next compared the 2 hairs recovered from the Oldsmobile's trunk with those taken from Kinney's head during autopsy. But Reese could only make a general comparison. The hairs recovered from the trunk were too damaged for a conclusive analysis.
The hairs had been severed at the proximal end or near the scalp by blunt force, so we couldn't see any of the root structures there. But they exhibited human hair characteristics that were most similar to that of Mr. Kinney.
Reese's analysis brought investigators one step closer to making their case. But it still wasn't enough. Experts conducted an extensive examination of Miller's handwriting. The unique characteristics identified in the ransom note matched those from Miller's sample.
Miller?
Yes.
Despite his protests, Miller was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Detectives determined that Miller had wanted to help his father get out of financial problems. He turned to the person he called his friend. On the night of May 8, 1985, Michael Kinney dropped off his girlfriend and headed back home. Police theorized that he was flagged down by his friend.
How's it going, Mike? Hey, Todd.
Completely unaware of what was about to befall him,
Hey, Mike.
Kinney was an easy mark for the cold-blooded violence Miller had planned.
What's up with the gun, man?
After striking Kinney's head, Miller loaded him into the trunk of his car and quickly fled the scene. Miller drove to an isolated farm, where he then shot and killed the still unconscious Kinney. To cover his tracks, Miller hid the body in a derelict ice house. He then returned home and coldly set in motion his plans to extort Kinney's mother. At his trial, Todd Miller was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, possession of ransom money, and forgery. He received 2 life terms plus 20 years. In a community near Preston, Washington, another missing persons case was to turn deadly. On September 4th, 1996, Rex and Shirley Wren reported their son, 35-year-old James Brad Wren, missing. They told police that their son's roommate, Emmett Marcel, was known to be violent.
Well, he's got brown hair.
The parents told police that 2 months before, Marcel became enraged at their son while the two were working on the house they shared together.
Emmett?
Wren left the residence so Marcel could cool off. When Wren returned later that night, Marcel shot him in the leg.
Oh my gosh!
Their son had refused to press charges. The information was enough for police to open a missing persons investigation. A background check revealed that police had been dispatched to Marcel and Wren's residence several times before to settle angry disputes between the two men. On August 10th, a month after the shooting, Wren called 911 to file a formal complaint against Marcel for another incident. He had not been seen since. Assigned to the Major Crimes Unit of the King County Sheriff's Office, Detective Denny Gula headed the investigation to locate the missing man.
The last time he was seen was with a King County police officer. There was a disturbance at his house, and Sergeant Bachmeyer, the patrol supervisor at that time, had contacted him at home and transported him to the Fall City substation.
Gula began by reviewing the responding officer's log of the August 10th incident. Records showed that Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer had taken Wren to a nearby police station, taken a statement, then released him. Hoping for more detailed information, Detective Gula put in phone calls to Sergeant Bachmeyer. While waiting for a response, he continued his investigation. He questioned Wren's neighbors. One, Richard Pettygrove, recalled that the last time he saw Wren was on August 10th. He reported seeing Wren driven away in a police car following a fight between Wren and his roommate, Emmett Marcel.
A real angry
Richard
person.
described Emmett Marcel as a dangerous and angry person.
Yeah.
All of the neighbors felt certain Marcel had something to do with Wren's disappearance.
My business cards.
Detective Gula ran Marcel's name through the law enforcement database. Marcel had recently been put in a Tacoma jail for an unrelated traffic violation. For investigators, it was time to pay a visit to the prime suspect in James Wren's disappearance.
CCU. Okay, thank you.
Police
very
in
much.
King County, Washington searched for 35-year-old James Brad Wren, reported missing by his parents. Wren's roommate, Emmett Marcel, was quickly becoming the prime suspect. Police went to question him in a Tacoma jail, where he sat for unrelated traffic violations.
Is your name Emmett Marcel?
Yes.
Marcel agreed to take a polygraph. He appeared unconcerned and claimed to have no idea about where Wren might be.
Did you or did you not?
On the evening of August 10th, the day Wren was last seen, Emmett claimed he was with a friend in nearby Tukwila, Washington.
You do not know why you...
Though the polygraph strongly indicated he was telling the truth, investigators were unconvinced. They obtained warrants to search Marcel's car. On the floorboard, investigators found a prescription bottle with Wren's name on it. They also found a hammer with a reddish-brown substance on it. In the lab, samples of the reddish-brown flecks on the hammer were tested, but no conclusive results could be reached. The samples were too deteriorated. The case against Marcel seemed to be going nowhere. A search warrant was obtained for Marcel and Wren's residence.
See anything else out of the unusual?
Inside, a suspicious stain on the carpet drew the investigators' attention. Samples of the stain were preserved on swabs. Detectives hoped this was the break they needed.
We're thinking that this is a pretty substantial piece of evidence. We sent it off to the crime lab for processing. And what we find out is that it's bovine or cow's blood.
With no physical evidence tying Marcel to Wren's disappearance, he was eliminated as a suspect. They hoped that Officer Bachmeier, who had taken Wren's statement on August 10th, could shed some light on the disappearance. After several weeks, Bachmeier finally contacted detectives and came in for questioning. He apologized for the delay, saying he was under a lot of pressure, which was recently compounded when his home had been burglarized and set on fire. In fact, he explained that when he responded to the 911 on August 10th, he recognized Wren. Bachmeier was certain Wren was the person he had seen fleeing from his house after it had caught fire. When Wren was brought in to file his complaint, Bachmeier confronted him about the arson. Wren admitted to the crimes. But after writing out his confession, Wren stormed out of the station. For Detective Gula, Bachmeier's story seemed odd.
You know, people just don't storm off and walk out of the police station, especially when this person has just admitted to you to have burned your house down.
Okay, now let's try to...
Though it was unclear if Bachmeier was involved in Wren's disappearance, investigators decided to take a closer look into the arson and burglary at his home. Detective Gula met with the Renton PD arson investigators who had been the first to look into the fire at Bachmeier's house. After first believing the motive behind the fire was possibly an act of revenge by a criminal, they were now convinced Bachmeier had set the fire himself. The arsonist had used flares stuck in plastic containers to start the blaze, a method that would give the perpetrator plenty of time to leave the scene before the fire actually caught. The investigation further revealed numerous valuable items, including jewelry, limited edition prints, CDs, and leather jackets, had been removed from the house prior to the fire and stored in the garage to avoid being damaged. King County Sheriff's Detective Sue Peters also worked the investigation.
Basically, Renton police detectives were concerned and thought Bachmeier possibly could be a suspect because one of the neighbor ladies had actually seen what she believed was Sergeant Bachmeyer leaving on his motorcycle in the middle of the night, and then several minutes later, his house is on fire.
Due to all of the conflicting circumstances, Bachmeyer's insurance company had refused to pay his claim unless he took a polygraph, something he refused to do. He was stripped of his badge and gun and was suspended from the department. He was now the prime suspect in Wren's disappearance. But police had no motive and no body to suggest a crime had taken place. Investigators would have to outsmart a man who knew how to hide evidence. Police in Washington State were beginning to suspect that fellow officer Sergeant Matt Bachmeyer was responsible for the disappearance of 35-year-old James Brad Wren. According to Bachmeyer, Wren had confessed to torching and burglarizing the officer's home just before he disappeared. A copy of Wren's confession to Sergeant Bachmeyer was obtained. Each page bore Wren's signature. The statement and the signatures, however, appeared to be written in a different hand. But it was not unusual for an investigator to write out a story and have a suspect sign it. To be sure, the confession was sent to a handwriting expert. Examiners determined that the signature at the bottom of each page was in Wren's handwriting, while the statement itself was in Bachmeyer's. But the analysis revealed something more interesting. Though the entire statement was written in the same color ink, one type of pen had been used to write the first 2 pages, which pertained to Wren's complaint about Emmett Marcel, but pages 3, 4, and 5 had been written with a different pen. Those pages contained Wren's confession to the arson and burglary. For investigators, a clearer picture was beginning to emerge.
It was my belief that Brad Wren was going to be used as the suspect of the arson, which he was, according to Sergeant Bachmeyer. And, you know, the case is really all tied together, that Sergeant Bachmeyer was becoming the focus of the arson of his own home, and so he needed to find someone that he could say set his house on fire to clear him. So he picked Brad Wren, who led a very simple life.
Search warrants were obtained for the patrol car Sergeant Bachmeyer used on the evening of August 10th. Small reddish-brown stains were found on the back seat and armrest of the patrol car. The rear seat covering was removed. Investigators were shocked to discover a much bigger stain in the foam padding. It appeared a large amount of substance had seeped through the upholstery and into the cushion. Samples of each stain were taken to the crime lab. They all tested positive for human blood. When confronted about the evidence, Bachmeyer stated Wren had experienced a nosebleed while in the patrol car.
You being the one.
Police didn't buy it. Examiners developed experiments to determine how much blood it would take to leave such a large stain under the patrol car's rear seat. By using different amounts of human blood to soak back seats from similar patrol cars, criminalists ascertained the absorption rate of the foam padding and the amount of blood needed to make a similar size stain. They determined that a minimum of 200 milliliters, or nearly a cup of blood, was involved. Far more than even the worst nosebleed would produce. Examiners had to prove that the blood in the patrol car came from Wren. But without a body, there were no samples to compare. It fell to forensic chemist Kim Duddy to find a way around that problem.
Both his biological parents were still alive and were willing to give blood samples. So our DNA unit took the blood samples from both his biological mother and father and tested it to the question stain on the seat from Bachmeyer's vehicle.
The DNA analysis showed that the blood from Bachmeier's patrol car had come from the biological child of Rex and Shirley Wren. Even without a body, the evidence was now overwhelming that Sergeant Matt Bachmeier was responsible for the murder of James Wren. The veteran police officer was arrested. If any doubt remained, it was cleared up on February 2nd, 1997, less than 3 months after Bachmeier's arrest. Bone and clothing fragments were found near a secluded cul-de-sac in Cougar Mountain Park. Among the most identifiable pieces were a skull and a red, white, and blue cast. Keys to the gated park were found on Bachmeier's keychain. Police believe that Sergeant Bachmeier's scheme to make some easy cash by setting up a phony arson of his home backfired when his insurance company became suspicious. He needed to prove to them that criminal forces were out to get him. Wren became a patsy in his twisted plan. Sergeant Matt Bachmeier was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Killers who strike without remorse, whose motives are obscure, can frustrate detectives in their efforts to solve a case. But dogged investigation, coupled with patience and the ever-advancing scientific methods of the crime lab, can often produce results, no matter how cold-blooded the crime.